stand at the intersection of Central Avenue and Wyatt Earp Boulevard in Dodge City, Kansas today. It is a quiet, orderly place, typical of the modern American Midwest. If you look around, you will see the red brick facade of the restored Santa Fe Depot, hear the distant rhythmic hum of a semi-truck on the highway, and perhaps catch the faint, sweet scent of parched prairie grass baking under the afternoon sun. It feels like a town that found its peace over a century ago. But if you could reach into the dry Kansas air and pull back the veil of exactly 150 years, if you could strip away the asphalt, the power lines, the brick, and the silence, you would find yourself standing in the chaotic eye of a human hurricane. What you are about to see is not the Wild West of television or the sanitized sets of Hollywood movies. We are moving beyond the myth of the noble sheriff and the perfectly choreographed duel at high noon. Using advanced AI reconstruction techniques, grounded in original 1870s town plats, National Register of Historic Places records, and the visceral diaries of those who actually walked these streets, we are going to rebuild the wickedest city in America, from the dirt up. We are traveling back to the year 1872. This was a time when this ground did not smell like Kansas wheat or clean air. It smelled like the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood, the overwhelming pungent odor of 200,000 buffalo hides rotting in the sun, and the suffocating stench of millions of pounds of animal waste. This is the real Dodge City. This is how the frontier actually looked, felt, tasted, and sounded. Welcome to the reconstruction of a legend. To understand the madness of Dodge, you have to understand why it exists in the middle of what 19th century maps called the Great American Desert. In 1865, there was no city here. There was only a desperate camp of tents and dugouts called Buffalo City. It was a place for men who traded in death. Hunters moved across these vast, sun-scorched plains like a plague, systematically wiping out the great buffalo herds to satisfy the insatiable hunger for leather in the industrial centers of the East and Europe. The first sight any visitor would have seen was not a skyline, but literal mountains of hides. Imagine thousands of buffalo skins stacked 10 feet high along the dirt paths, waiting for transport. The profit was quick, but the environment was brutal. Buffalo City was a raw outpost of survival, where the only law was the caliber of your rifle and the speed of your horse. However, the fate of this camp would change forever with the arrival of the Iron Horse. In September 1872, the silver-gray rails of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad finally reached this exact spot. The railroad did not just bring people, it brought an economic ultimatum. While the buffalo were disappearing, a new empire was waiting in the South. In Texas, millions of longhorn cattle were roaming free, and the world was hungry for beef. Dodge City became, by a stroke of geographic luck and railroad ambition, the closest point where the dusty Texas cattle trails met the iron rails that led to the slaughterhouses of Chicago and the dinner tables of New York. As the AI begins to reconstruct the buildings of 1874, look closely at the structures lining the street. They are what historians call false front buildings. This was a form of architectural deception. Most of these buildings were made of green cottonwood timber, which began to warp, crack, and pull away from its frame almost as soon as the unrelenting Kansas sun hit it. To compensate for the shabbiness of the construction, builders added tall, square facades to the front of the shops. These facades were built disproportionately high to make the town appear permanent, wealthy, and imposing to anyone looking from the street. It was a visual lie designed to project stability in a place that was anything but stable. But if you walk around to the back of those facades, the illusion vanishes instantly. You would find tiny, cramped shacks with roofs made of sod or rotting canvas that leaked thick mud whenever the prairie storms rolled in. There were no trees for shade, no white picket fences, no gardens. Just a jagged line of raw, unpainted wood standing defiantly against an infinite, flat horizon of grass. The town was not built to last. It was built to extract as much wealth as possible, as quickly as possible, before the next big opportunity moved further west. It was a temporary city fueled by permanent greed. Let us walk down Front Street during the peak of the cattle season in 1875. This is the town's spine, its central nervous system. To your left are the Santa Fe Railroad tracks, the source of all noise and all gold. To your right is a solid, unbroken wall of saloons, gambling halls, and brothels that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The ground beneath your feet is a logistical nightmare. There is no pavement, no cobble, no gravel. In the height of summer, The constant Kansas wind whips the soil into a fine, white, alkaline powder that coats your throat and makes every breath taste like salt and dry earth. When the rains come, Front Street transforms into a canal of black, viscous gumbo mud, a foul mixture of soil, horse urine, and animal entrails. You would see men attempting to navigate raised wooden boardwalks, but even these were treacherous, slick with tobacco spit, spilled beer, and the blood of the previous night's altercations. There is the constant rhythmic thud-thud-thud of hammers, as Dodge was a city that never stopped being built or repaired. There is the shrill, piercing whistle of the steam locomotives. There is the low, mournful lowing of thousands of cattle in the stockyards. And above all, there is the music. Not a single lonely piano, but dozens of them, all playing different, clashing tunes from every open saloon door, creating a wall of sound that defined the town's chaotic energy. Dodge City was divided by a line of iron that was as much a moral boundary as a physical one. The railroad tracks were known as the Dead Line. To the north of the tracks, there was a desperate, often failing attempt at civilization. This was where the dry goods stores, the few resident families, and the respectable businessmen tried to maintain a sense of order. But once you crossed south of the tracks, you entered a different world. This was the territory of the soiled doves, the professional gamblers, and the men who did not want to be found. South of the Dead Line, the laws of the town council were mere suggestions. It was a landscape of vice designed specifically to separate a Texas cowboy from his hard-earned wages. In the AI Reconstruction, notice the density of people in this area. It was an international melting pot. You would see Texas drovers who had not bathed in 3 months, wealthy cattle barons in silk vests, European immigrants looking for land, and soldiers from nearby Fort Dodge. They were all drawn to the same place for the same reason: recreation. But in Dodge, recreation was a dangerous business that often ended at the tip of a knife or the barrel of a gun. Let us step inside the most famous room in the American West, the Long Branch Saloon. Popular legend tells us it was a place of romance and high-stakes chivalry. The historical records tell a much more pragmatic story. The Long Branch was not built by a visionary of the service industry. It was built on the result of a ball game. A group of soldiers from the fort lost a wager to local cowboys, and the price of their defeat was the lumber required to build a bar. Inside, the air is a thick blue fog of cheap cigar smoke and the heavy fumes of kerosene lamps. There is no ventilation, only the desperate flapping of handheld fans and the constant swinging of the slatted doors. The men here are not drinking fine, aged bourbon. They are consuming rot-gut whiskey, a liquid often stretched with tobacco juice, or even strychnine to give it a more powerful kick. The violence in the Long Branch was rarely like the movies. It was sudden, clumsy, and usually motivated by a disagreement over a game of faro or a drunken insult that neither party would remember the next day. The floor was covered in sawdust, primarily to soak up the spilled drinks and the various fluids that came with a room full of hundreds of unwashed men. This was the heart of the Dodge City economy, a machine designed to turn whisk and cards into cattle gold. This is where we meet the ghosts of the legends: Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Bill Tillman. Wyatt Earp in 1876 was not a disinterested hero of justice. He was a businessman, he was a gambler, a former buffalo hunter, and a man who understood that law in Dodge City was a commodity to be managed. The job of a Dodge City lawman was not necessarily to stop people from sinning. It was to ensure that the city received its cut of the profits. The lawman collected fines that functioned as a hidden municipal tax. If a cowboy fired his pistol into the air to celebrate his arrival, he was rarely thrown into a dungeon. Instead, he was fined $5 or $10. That money went directly into the city treasury to pay for the very boardwalks he stood upon. These lawmen were enforcers. They moved through the saloons not to start duels, but to buffalo people, a term of the era that meant striking a rowdy individual over the head with the long barrel of a Colt peacemaker to end a fight before it could damage the furniture. In Dodge, the greatest sin was not murder. It was disrupting the flow of commerce. History usually forgets the women of Dodge City, or it transforms them into romanticized figures like Miss Kitty of fiction. The reality was brutally different. Using AI to enhance the only surviving photographs, we can look into the eyes of women like Elizabeth Thompson, known to the locals as Squirrel Tooth Alice. She is the only woman confirmed to be buried in the original Boot Hill Cemetery. Her face looks decades older than her actual years. Prostitution in Dodge was not a glamorous choice. It was a desperate last resort for women abandoned by the Civil War. by poverty, or by husbands who never returned from the trail. They lived in tiny windowless cubicles called cribs, located in the alleyways behind the front street saloons. Libby Thompson became a local legend for a moment of unintentional tragic comedy. A sudden Kansas windstorm once blew several dollar bills out of her stockings, sending the town's vagrants on a desperate chase across the prairie to catch the flying money. But her everyday life was a cycle of physical abuse, infectious disease, and extreme isolation. Most of the soiled doves of Dodge died young, of undisclosed circumstances, which was often a polite historical euphemism for domestic violence or the slow rot of untreated illness. Libby Thompson represents the thousands of women who lived in the cracks of the cattle boom, their lives as fragile as the warped wood of the buildings. The world believes that Dodge City saw a shootout at high noon every single day. However, the historical data tells a different story. Between 1872 and 1885, there were fewer than 50 confirmed homicides in the city limits. But while violence was less frequent than the myths suggest, when it did occur, it was visceral and terrifying. There was a fascinating legal distinction in the 1870s, the concept of fair play versus cold blood. If you killed a man in a fight where both of you were armed and facing each other, the legal system in Ford County was pragmatically indifferent. You would likely be released under the claim of mutual combat or self-defense. The town accepted that in a place this volatile, men would settle their differences with lead. But if you killed a man in cold blood, shooting him in the back or while he was unarmed, the town would turn on you with a medieval fury. Justice was swift, often bypassing the wooden jail entirely and ending at the hangman's tree on the edge of town. The fear was not of the abstract law, but of the immediate retribution of a community that depended on a certain level of predictable order to keep the cattle money flowing. The AI reconstruction of the Dodge City Jail shows a cramped, dark space where the heat was unbearable. A place designed to hold a man just long enough for the circuit judge to arrive or the lynch mob to gather. Walk now with the AI as we move north, away from the noise of Front Street, up to the windswept ridge known as Boot Hill. In the 1870s, this was not a tourist attraction with bronze statues. It was a barren, desolate piece of land where the friendless were buried. The name was literal. Men were buried here with their boots on because the Kansas ground was too hard to dig deep graves, and the city refused to waste money on coffins for strangers who had no family to claim them. The reconstruction shows a hill of shifting dirt and crooked wooden markers, many of which had no names, only dates. Most of the bodies buried here were later moved when the town grew and needed the land for schools and churches. But the spirit of the hill remained as a constant visual warning. It was the final destination for those who could not get out of Dodge fast enough. Imagine the burial of an anonymous cowboy. There were no flowers, no long sermons, and no mourning period. There was only the sound of the relentless wind and the dull thud of dry earth falling onto leather boots. It was the abrupt end of a life of hard work, marking the transition from a living, breathing human being into a mere statistical footnote in the history of the American frontier. In 1885, the world of Dodge City came to a crashing, absolute halt. It was not a heroic lawman who cleaned up the town. It was a microscopic germ. Texas cattle were carrying a disease known as Texas fever or splenic fever. While the Longhorns themselves were immune, they carried ticks that devastated the local cattle of Kansas farmers. Fearing for their own agricultural economy, the Kansas legislature passed a draconian law banning the entry of Texas cattle into the state. Overnight, the trails were closed, the railroad depots went silent. The reason for Dodge's existence vanished. The thousands of cowboys, the gamblers, and the soiled doves left as quickly as they had arrived, moving on to the next wicked town further west in the territories. Watch as the AI reconstruction fast forwards through the late 1880s. The warped wooden false front buildings are torn down. They are replaced by solid, permanent structures of brick and stone. The saloons are converted into dry goods stores and pharmacies. The deadline of the railroad tracks becomes a simple crossing for families walking to church on Sunday morning. Dodge City did not die. It simply became respectable, burying its wild past under layers of agricultural progress and civic duty. Why then does Dodge City still dominate our cultural imagination? Why did the phrase, "get out of Dodge," become a universal metaphor for escaping danger, used by soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam and by teenagers in modern cities? It is because Dodge City was the ultimate experiment in American chaos. It was the place where the industrial 19th century world met the raw, unmapped, and violent frontier. It was a stage where a man could reinvent himself as a legend or lose everything over a single game of cards. It was the honest, unvarnished heart of the Western expansion. When we look at these reconstructed images, the deep mud of Front Street, the thick smoke of the Long Branch, the tired, haunted eyes of Squirrel Tooth Alice, and the cold, calculating gaze of Wyatt Earp, we are seeing the true DNA of the American West. It was not a place of shining heroes. It was a place of grueling work, unbearable smells, and a desperate, daily struggle for survival. Dodge City in the 1870s was a city that refused to vanish, even after its purpose was gone. Today, the wheat grows where the buffalo once ran, and the trains still whistle through the center of the town. But if you listen closely to that whistle, as it echoes off the brick buildings, you can still hear the ghost of a time when this was the most dangerous, most exciting, and most honest place on the face of the earth. You have seen the reconstruction. You have walked the boardwalks. Now, as the sepia tones of the past fade back into the colors of the modern day, remember, history is not just what we see in the movies. It is the very dirt beneath our feet, and the stories of those who were brave enough, or desperate enough, to call it home.